friends helping friends helping friends out. Family outside the house. Crevices and cracks that hide out. Rats trying to beat on the mouse. Creating and casting a shadow. Hiding the ones you call friends. Shining your spotlight right onto the people who challenge your ends. Freedoms when no one can see you. Powers when nobody cares. It's easy to point at the poor fool, robbing the crowd as they stare. Creating and casting a shadow, hiding the ones you call friends. Shining your spotlight right onto the people who challenge your ends. Creating and casting a shadow, hiding the ones you call friends. Shining your spotlight right onto the people who challenge your ends.
All right. Sorry for anyone who was for anyone who was back in that previous stream and cut out there. The problem is, for some reason, in this house, if the phone rings, then we lose internet. Like, we live in the 90s. We live in a period of time in which the fucking phone rings and everyone loses internet connection for some period, and it's so infuriating. So if anyone from the previous stream is here, I apologise for that. And we're back now. Hopefully the phone won't ring again. It's all fine. So where were we? we were talking about neoliberalism, like always, and we were talking about this article. I'll reintroduce the article in case anyone comes across this stream, and I'll do a bit of repetition just to introduce anyone who's new to this. So don't worry, I won't go over it all in excruciating detail, but we'll go over it briefly again, just to introduce anyone new to the topic. All two of you who are here. It was annoying. I was just getting to 10 viewers was more viewers than I'd had in any of these streams, and then some idiot phones the house and we lose internet connection. So annoying. So, just tweeting out again that we're back online. So, for anyone new, what we were talking about was this article which talks about the myth of neoliberalism from a politics professor in the UK who clearly doesn't think that neoliberalism is a real thing, despite the massive evidence that it is. And one of the first things that he's pointed to is that few people self-identify as neoliberal. Now, his point is wrong, because many people these days do self-identify as neoliberal, but even if he was right, it wouldn't really matter, because, and this is a topic which I covered in the introduction to my PhD. Welcome to the 2 new viewers. If you're coming from the previous stream, I'm sorry, the phone rang and it cuts off the internet in my house, which is apparently lives in a perpetual 90s for some reason. So even if lots of people didn't self-identify as neoliberal, it wouldn't matter, because why would someone who self-identifies as neoliberal, who is aware that it's used as a term of abuse, why would they then self-identify their political project, particularly in the days before it was a more rehabilitated ideology? Why would someone like Tony Blair decide that he wanted to call himself a neoliberal when he was trying to frame himself as a democratic socialist? And it's one of the specific parts of neoliberal ideology, is that it claims to be an objective, natural reality. That's one of its ideological tricks, that it's describing the natural reality. So why would someone then feel the need to describe themselves as a neoliberal? That would give up the game, wouldn't it? That would tell someone, that would say, oh, this is just another ideology with just another claim on the truth, rather than the natural reality which neoliberalism seeks to paint itself as. And this is reflected with people like Tony Blair, who consistently described his policy programme not as neoliberalism, but as a programme of, quote, modernisation, as if the new Labour policy platform were the natural progression of modern politics and not simply another political ideology. And secondly, it's not unreasonable to assume that some political actors aren't even necessarily aware that they're acting in line with a specific ideology. Like, especially if that ideology has become so institutionalized, so embedded. So, as someone was saying in the previous stream, which was which we lost because of the phone, as someone was saying, it's hegemonic. It's become common sense. So they might not necessarily be aware that they are neoliberal. And there's lots of evidence that neoliberalism is a specific ideology, and one which finds specific and consistent patterns of existence within varying different contexts. Firstly, there's a regularity of certain elements of neoliberalism that are repeated across varying contexts, and secondly, these elements all seemingly share underlying basic assumptions and political goals, and we'll get into a bit what those assumptions and political goals are as we go through this dog shit piss article called The Myth of Neoliberalism. So, to sum up that rant, I no longer have wine anymore to take dramatic sips of and to calm my nerves. To sum up that rant, so not only is Professor Colin Talbot, the author of this article, factually wrong, but even if he was right, it would be essentially meaningless. Which is, good start, Professor. Good start for your your bad article. Hi, Mithril. Thanks for joining us. If you were in the previous stream, we lost that because I got a phone call. Well, I didn't even get a phone call. I don't get phone calls. I'm not popular enough for phone calls. That's why I'm streaming to you, beautiful people, instead of talking to any friends I don't have. But the house got a phone call, and I lost internet for a while. So this is Stream Mark 2. So moving on. Talbot is going to use one source here, one source to define neoliberalism, and it's David Harvey. And now I like David Harvey. I've used his work on neoliberalism before. It's a good starting off point, but he is by no means the definitive voice on the subject. And if you're going to make the astounding claim that that neoliberalism just doesn't exist, I would expect you to maybe engage in some more literature than just one book which is self-described A Brief History on Neoliberalism. Like that's the title of the Harvey book that he's about to talk about is literally called A Brief History of Neoliberalism. It's not a comprehensive understanding of it. But let's read the quote that Harvey that they're using here, that Harvey gives as an understanding of what neoliberalism is and why Talbot then might disagree with it. So Harvey says neoliberalism is in the first instance a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterised by strong private property rights, free markets and free trade. The role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. The state has to guarantee, for example, the quality and integrity of money. It must also set up the military, defence, police and legal structures and functions required to secure private property rights and guarantee, by force if need be, the proper functions of the market. Furthermore, if markets do not exist in areas such as land, water, education, healthcare, social security, environmental pollution, then they must be created by state action if necessary. But beyond these tasks, the state should not venture. State interventions in markets, once created, must be kept to a bare minimum because, according to the theory, the state cannot possibly possess enough information to second-guess market signals, quote, prices, and because powerful interest groups will inevitably distort and bias state interventions, particularly in democracies, for their own benefit. So, now, this is what Talbot says in response to this is quite indicative, because he fundamentally, I think, misunderstands this really basic introduction to neoliberalism that Harvey is providing us. And again, I can't stress enough, Harvey's definition of neoliberalism here, I don't fully agree with it, and we'll go into that a bit later on, but it's very basic. This is a very, very basic definition, and this professor of government, can you fit professor in the piss in the word professor? Pissfessor of government? Never mind. Sorry, that's a tangent. This professor of government is going to misunderstand it. So let's read what Talbot says of this quote from David Harvey. Talbot's response to this is, "Let us be clear. What this means in concrete terms, it would be a reversion to roughly what the state did in the middle to late part of the 19th century in what is now called the OECD countries. It would be what has often been called the night watchman state, providing for property rights, contracts, markets, and personal and national security, and not much else. This meant, in the latter part of the 19th century, the state collected through taxes and spent on public activities less than 10% of national wealth created. Even less was spent on what might be called social protections or welfare. Public employment, except for the military, was minimum and regulation scant." So, here's Talbot's misunderstanding of Harvey's basic definition of neoliberalism. Because neoliberalism, even as Harvey describes it here, is specifically not the night watchman small state. And if you notice how Harvey's definition emphasises the legal and institutional order with the purpose to both expand and protect markets by force. This is separate from a night watchman state which didn't view the creation of new markets as, in theory, the role of the state. And also, this is specifically like what's if you look at the things listed by Talbot here, providing basically property rights, contracts, markets, and personal and national security, and not much else. What Harvey lists is already more comprehensive than that. When he talks about the military, defence, police, legal structures and functions required to secure private property rights and to guarantee by force the proper functioning of the market. Now that can already expand to stopping things like the 2008 global financial crash, which resulted in a huge amount of state intervention to support the market. That would already be encompassed within the definition that Harvey goes to here, which is definitely beyond the scope of what Talbot is talking about. But going beyond Harvey, as you should, because he's one thinker and by no means the definitive voice on the topic, what separates neoliberalism from classical liberalism, like the night watchman state, as Talbot is talking about it here, are a few core assumptions and political goals, like we were talking about earlier. Firstly, and this is something missing from Harvey's definition, neoliberalism is a process of change. It's a drive towards something, like it's a utopian ideology that seeks to create the perfect free market system. Crucially, it doesn't see it existing. It has to be forced into being. And this is an entirely separate, fundamental philosophy and ideology than the one that exists within the night watchman classical liberal state. Within classical liberalism, that viewed capitalism as naturally occurring, as like the naturally, and the individual to be naturally capitalistic. So the night watchman state made theoretical sense. Get the state out of everything, everything will be fine. We will, the free market will flourish because the state won't be there to get in the way of what is the real fundamental free market system. But by contrast, neoliberalism sees the capitalist individual and the state and the free market system as something which has to be actively created, and the system of capitalism as one which needs forced into being. So if you go back to Harvey, where I would draw a distinction between his definition and mine, is that I would say the state needs to be reshaped and reformed so that it can effectively create the free market system. And I think that is the nub, the essential part of neoliberalism, that these things need to be reformed and reshaped. That is the fundamental process at work. Mithril is saying, forcing something into being suggests that its inherent weaknesses are either overlooked or ignored. I'm not sure I exactly understand what you're saying. Are you saying that neoliberals think that the failings of capitalism are something that they have to overlook or ignore in order to force it into being? I'll get into the reasons below about why. Oh, okay, yeah, fair. I'll get into the reasons in a bit about why neoliberals believe that this is the case, but why they believe that the state has to be changed and why the individual has to be forced into being in order to get capitalism to work. And it is regarding like the history of increasing collectivization and the threat of communism, which existed in the early parts of the 20th century, which the early neoliberal thinkers were getting into. Because Talbot is about to talk some bullshit about the underlying positions behind neoliberalism. So what a neoliberal state looks like in practice, and what these underlying philosophies and political goals look like in practice, is that the state is used quite ruthlessly to create those desired effects. And Harvey points to this slightly, he sort of hints at it, and it's not made explicit enough within this small quote. When he says that sometimes markets have to be created by force. One example of this would be something like Thatcher's war with the unions in the 80s, which was specifically done as a process to reshape the state and individual labour conditions with the purpose to create a more free market capitalist system distinct from the post-war Keynesian compromise. I talk about this more in my neoliberalism class 1 pacification video, but this was definitely not a small state night watchman act. It involved the state exerting extreme influence across the media, the courts, the police, union law, all with the purpose to reach into the lives of people and change who they were. Thatcher famously said herself, quote, "Economics are the method, the goal is to change the soul," which I don't really think is a particularly small state night watchman thing to say that the state should use economics to reach into the very souls of people and change them. But it is a very neoliberal thing to say, because that is the underlying process and philosophy at work within neoliberalism. And this goes on with things like neoliberalism and welfare, which will come up a bit later on as well. Under neoliberalism, welfare isn't necessarily retreated in the sense that the state spending for it is made smaller, but it's changed. It retreats in the sense that it no longer is open to everyone, because it creates whole new institutional frameworks which are designed to change behaviour of individuals by putting them in particular tests. Like, for example, in universal credit right now, the major out of work benefit in the UK, part of that is that, outside of COVID times, part of of universal credit is that you need to constantly be seeking more and better work, and you need to be ensuring that you fit with these particular requirements of seeking work for 35 hours a week, or seeking more hours, or meeting responsibilities that you agree with the government. And if you don't, then your benefits are reduced and you're sanctioned. And that is in a sense a retraction of the welfare state, in that it is no longer a universal benefit paid to everyone, no matter what. Like job seekers allowance back in the 70s. Not job seekers allowance. No, sorry, that was an introduction of Thatcherism. The previous out of work benefits before neoliberalism, which basically said if you were out of work you could claim it. They've retreated in the sense that if you're out of work you can't just claim it. You have to meet these particular standards of how much you seek work, or how many hours you get. And the purpose of this is to change the behaviour of individuals, to try and make them more capitalistic, more individually responsible, in big air quotes, and while keeping them within a reserve army of labour to keep wages low for businesses. That's another purpose of these things. And you can find example after example of non-small state governance, which some people like Talbot later on, like Big Colin in this terrible article, will argue later on, is against neoliberalism. But if you just work out and understand what neoliberalism actually is, you can see how government action is not necessarily anti-neoliberal. But this thing about the latter part of the 19th century, the size of public spending and taxing, and the number of people in public service jobs is small. This is his thesis, because he's going to argue that this is what neoliberalism wants, which is already based off the shaky assumption. So we've already tackled that assumption, but he's going to argue from this point that these things, that 10% of public spending being less than 10% of GDP, is the indicator of neoliberalism, when it's not. That's his main thesis statement here. It's less of a thesis and more of a basically his argument here is state spending was small in the 18th century but is bigger now, so clearly things are different now, which is a very incisive point, Colin. He nailed that one. Moving on to the strange inversion of neoliberalism. By the way, anyone in chat, feel free to interrupt and ask questions at any time. I'm very open to chatting away and breaking up my ranting about terrible piss artist government professors with anything else. If anyone was in the last stream, feel free to just chat away as well. So he goes on to say, the idea that this is what is meant by neoliberalism is odd in several ways. I mean, it is odd because that is not what is meant by neoliberalism. He's decided that's what's meant by neoliberalism. This is going to get into some strange territory here, but let's just read out this section. The first concerns the origins of the term neoliberal itself. It originated in the 1930s in Germany as a counterpoint to classical night watchman liberalism that espoused only free markets, free trade, and sometimes but not always more democratic rights. Neoliberalism was precisely new in that it embraced social as well as political and economic rights. It recognised that social protection, workers' rights, public health, education and other welfare provisions were both progressive and would actually be helpful to the development of capitalist society. In a somewhat bizarre twist of fate, the term neoliberalism was inverted in Latin America in the post-Chile coup of 1972 to mean almost the opposite of its origins in the 1930s. Oh hey Pinko Punko, thanks for coming. You missed the moment when the stream failed, so you've not missed a whole much. What do they say? Yeah, back to the piss article. Instead of enhanced social protection and placing boundaries on markets, it came to mean exactly the opposite. A reversion, in theory at least, to 19th century free market liberalism, and it even removed the 19th century commitment to political liberalism. Now, this is one of the most uninformed, bizarre summing up of neoliberalism as a concept, as an origin that I have ever come across in my life. And I want to stress enough, this is a professor of government who's coming out with this stuff. There's utterly banal, wrong, just factually incorrect stuff. So, like, either Colin here, the author Colin, either he's misread or is deliberately misinterpreting some stuff. He's conflating ordoliberalism, which formed part of the ideological stew of neoliberalism, which is that the stuff he's talking about that originated in the 1930s Germany as a counterpoint to night watchman liberalism. That is ordoliberalism. What he's talking about is a form of liberalism which emphasised the structures of the state and ensuring that the market didn't get out of hand. It was basically a regulatory framework with some bits and pieces added on. That's what ordoliberalism was. And it formed part of the ideological stew of neoliberalism, but definitely not the whole of it. And it's definitely not something which is analogous or you just can't switch up these terms, ordoliberalism and neoliberalism. They're different things. They're fundamentally different. Pinko Punko saying, whoa, this guy's a professor? Jesus. Yeah, this guy's a professor, not just a professor, he's a professor of government and politics. And he's talking this shite. So, I mean, if this stream gets out, it might affect my career. Oh well. Colin Talbot, your writing is bad. You should stick to things you know, because it's clearly not neoliberalism. And then he goes on to describe the Chilean coup as the opposite of neoliberalism. What this makes me think is that despite the name of the piece, what Talbot is trying to do isn't say that the neoliberalism is a myth, but is to actually just defend it. And, you know, that's par for the course of the people who do tend to say that, oh, this ideology, which is hegemonic of the time, doesn't exist. What they really are trying to do is defend it and say that, oh, actually everything's probably okay now. We can just talk about this stuff. It's okay. Pinochet wasn't neoliberalism. No, sure, it wasn't. That was actually the opposite of neoliberalism. Let's spend a sec getting into why. Just the scale in which Professor Colin Talbot is wrong here. Like I said, ordoliberalism was a form of liberal capitalism which emphasised the role of the state in providing a market framework in which capitalism could work. It by no means meant they entailed the rest of the ideological goals of neoliberalism, which again emphasised the restructuring of the state and the individual in the name of markets. And if we get into the underlying reasons why neoliberalism was first formulated, And it was first formulated in the Walter Lippmann colloquial, and then after that the Montpellier Society, in which a bunch of dickhead economists and philosophers like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and Ludwig von Mises, or Mises, I can never remember which one's which, they all... so would ordoliberalism be like FDR capitalism? No, not really. FDR capitalism would be a much larger social democratic reform within a more classically liberal frame. It's ORDO liberalism, not Ardo. That's my accent at work there. Ordo. I would call FDR capitalism more of a social democratic reform within a liberal framework rather than ordoliberalism. Ordoliberalism is something which is very specific to Germany in the 1930s, basically. It doesn't really exist outside of that context. So the idea of calling neoliberalism basically ordoliberalism is fundamentally false. It's just wrong. It's just not what it is. So, the Montpellier Society and Walter Lippmann colloquial took these economists and philosophers like Hayek, Friedman and von Mises, and they were despairing. These economists and philosophers, they were despairing over the increasing collectivizations of society in the form of Keynesianism, Keynesian social democracy in the West, and Soviet communism in the East. This was in the post-war period the Montpellier Society took place. And this is the despair which drove them. This despair over what they saw is what drove them to understand what collectivization needed to be forcibly stopped, and the state and individual had to be reshaped into their free market utopia. In no conceivable sense did that original formulation of neoliberalism recognise social protection, workers' rights, public health and education. And in fact, it very specifically viewed those things not only as inefficient, but as morally repugnant. That's something that's often missing from analysis of neoliberalism, is it's not just an economic theory. It's not just about efficiencies and market distortions, but it's a moral theory about how things should work. And you can see that come up over and over again. Thatcher hated socialism. She hated collectivization. She hated the unions because she saw them as fundamentally morally corrupt. And that is the same thing that these thinkers thought as well. They thought that the Soviet Union was out of order, but they thought that the social democratic reforms of Keynesianism in the West were almost equally out of order. And Hayek wrote his famous book, the Road to Serfdom, about how this collectivization would lead to like fascism or whatever, which is ironic given that Hayek himself was very sceptical, and neoliberalism in general is sceptical of democracy. And you can see a talk about that in the authoritarian neoliberalism video. But essentially, they see anything which allows collective democratic control over anything economic as fundamentally immoral. They hate it. They try to get it out of your hands. Neoliberalism, basically, in regard to these social protections, and there's an implication here that the way that Talbot describes it, there's an implication that social and economic human rights are more fundamentally protected under neoliberalism, under at least what he sees as real neoliberalism, which is a bizarre and untrue thing to say, as it's not even protected under social democratic reforms of Keynesianism, famously. In 1948, with the formation of the UDHR and the provision of social and economic rights, was the result of compromise between capitalist Western states and Soviet and global South states who wanted the social democratic, the social and economic rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the idea that even more market reform people would want would want social and economic protection is just bizarrely wrong. You can see that today. A lot of neoliberals will just straight up deny that that economic and social human rights are human rights, and the purpose of that is to deny that the protection for unions or the protection for education or healthcare isn't a human right at all. Neoliberalism basically held that there should be some welfare for individuals who couldn't exist in the market, but it was hardly any kind of social protection which exists in social democracy. And like I said earlier, the more important driver within welfare is to find ways to force the individual into particular behavioural patterns. And then we get to this bizarre point that he's making, that somehow the Chilean coup of Augustus Pinochet was the exact opposite of neoliberalism. Now this would be an incredible thing to happen, that the coup in Chile, in which one of the founders of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman, and his students in the Chicago School directly advised the fascist Pinochet government, and which another founder of neoliberalism, Friedrich Hayek, defended, was an inversion of neoliberalism? That would be such an incredible thing to happen, that these two founders of neoliberalism, over such a short period of time, totally inverted what they thought of as their core ideology, as the ideology which informed Thatcher and Reagan, and then later Clinton and Blair. But they decided, without telling anyone, without changing any of their writings, without changing any of their teachings to their think tanks and their university cohorts, that somehow they'd changed it and flipped everything about. Which, and if I was going to take an argument about whether or not the Chilean coup represented neoliberalism or not, I would maybe not make that argument, because I don't think it's tenable. I don't know how you could look at the Chilean coup with Friedman and Hayek supporting it and think, oh, that must be the opposite of neoliberalism. It fundamentally doesn't make sense. So either Talbot here is outright lying. Either he is lying about what he knows about this ideology, or he's just too lazy to even bother fact-checking his dog shit. And I can't stress enough, again, this guy is a professor of politics and government at a British university. And he can come up with this shit. Moving on to the next section then. From liberalism to liberal social democracy. Before the end of... Let's just read a bit of here. I'm not like 100% sure what he's trying to say with this section. He basically... I won't read it all. He's basically saying that GDP and percentage of GDP spent on public spending and public employment was much lower in the classical liberal era than it was now. And I don't... Sorry, Punko, I didn't see your things there. What are you saying? Does he even go beyond saying the Chilean coup was an inversion of neoliberalism, or does he just drop it and move on? What he says, I'll read out exactly what he says, because this is the extent of his what he says on the Chilean coup. He says, in a somewhat bizarre twist of fate, the term neoliberalism was inverted in Latin America in the post-Chile coup era to mean almost the opposite of its origins in the 1930s. Instead of enhanced social protection and placing boundaries on markets, it came to mean exactly the opposite, a reversion, in theory at least, to the 19th century free market liberalism, and even removed from 19th century commitment to political liberalism. So that's all he says. That's the entirety of his argument of neoliberalism. Now, if you want to like functionally pick apart the argument, at no point has he really established that neoliberalism fundamentally means 19th century small state governments. He's not, I don't think, in my view, provided an adequate evidence to support that point. The second point is he's not at any section talked about the commitment, proved that there was a 19th century commitment to political liberalism. Because if I remember the 19th century and the standard of political liberalism then, it wasn't great. Large swathes of people, men, women, black people, did not have much access to the political liberalism of that age. So quite a bizarre thing to just drop and claim with no supporting evidence. So that's all he says on Chile. And to answer your question, Punko. In 19th century liberalism, more protection for child minors. Yeah. So in this, I'm just gonna skip to the end of this section, because basically the crux of his argument here is that is this bit. So he says, at the start of neoliberalism, usually marked. Mithro saying, sadly I'm having to leave shortly. Would enjoy your take on some of John Gray's recent New Statesman essays. They've been dreadful. Well, I've not seen them. If someone sends me them, I might take a look at that for another stream, probably in the new year. But I can't imagine the New Statesman essays being particularly good. But if someone wants to put me through the hell of doing that, then feel free to send them to me. So what? And thanks for popping along, Mithro. I'm glad to have you. So, Big Colin, what does he say? At the start of neoliberalism, usually marked by the elections of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the state was more than 4 times the size it had been in 1870. Even in supposedly liberal market democracies like the USA, public spending was around 1/3 of GDP. What this is a bizarre thing to me. It's made my head sort of fritz out, because it's such a bizarre argument to make. That, because what he's trying to say is that because the state was large when neoliberalism started, then it wasn't neoliberalism. As if in politics you switch a switch and suddenly you could go back to 19th century liberalism, which, and I can't stress this enough, is not what neoliberalism is. But he's just asserted this and assumed this is the case. But below here we're going to get into the crux of his argument, of what he's saying, of what he thinks neoliberalism is. We'll move on to this next section. He says, certainly in rhetoric, the 1980s saw a dramatic shift in tone from conservative politicians fed by ideas from right-wing free market think tanks. Thatcher famously declared her intentions to roll back the frontier of the state, and Reagan that government wasn't the answer, it was the problem. And then it goes on to talk about some more bollocks. And then he says, but reread the David Harvey quote again, which is, and I mean this very not politely at all, that's something that Colin himself very much needs to do. Reread the David Harvey quote above. It clearly suggests that neoliberalism was supposedly committed to a really radical rolling back of the state to something more like pre-World War I small government. At no point does David Harvey's quote say that. That is something that Talbot is inferring from that. Probably not in good faith. And then it goes on to say, indeed Harvey goes on to say, there has everywhere been an emphatic turn towards neoliberalism in political, economic practices and thinking since the 1970s. Deregulation, privatisation and withdrawal of the state from many areas of social provision have been all too common. Now, it's true that some of these things began to happen, but on a far smaller scale than real neoliberal agenda would suggest. And basically, and here Talbot goes on to explain how public spending, this is a fantastic thing he's saying. It's a bizarre thing, does not make sense. Basically, the crux of his argument below here is that public spending has remained high, and that there has been a relatively stable amount of people in public service employment. That is his argument. He says that public spending averaged 40.5% of GDP. A decade of neoliberalism later, it was 42.1% of GDP, and so on and so on. he talks about the stable state of public employment. But this is the crux of his argument. Because state spending has increased, then that means neoliberalism is not happening. But as we've established above, if anyone's been here long enough to listen, the increased neoliberalism isn't just rolling back of the state, but a process of state and individual reshaping. Taking welfare reforms again, neoliberal reforms can be massively expensive and create huge bureaucracies. But that's not really the point. Like, the point isn't that these programs exist. It's not that there's huge public spending. The point is to reshape the individual. And the point is to make sure that people start engaging in these more competitive, more individualistic, more capitalistic, entrepreneurial, individually responsible actions. And it provides, and these welfare states provide cheap labour as a reserve army of labour to corporations. But also, taking state spending on board, some of the biggest increases in state spending have been in things like pensions, which is a reflection of ageing demographics and the power of older voting blocks more than it's a reflection of neoliberalism not existed. And even pensions have themselves been limited, with the pension age going up and up and up. So there has been a retrenchment in that case of the state providing. Yeah, the Pinko Plunko, the flip side to that claim is that more state spending means more socialist, and that's ludicrous. Exactly. I mean, he makes that he at the end of his article, he says these things himself, but it's amazing to me that it doesn't click with him. Then there's state spending increasing. There's like state spending on things like defence, which has increased, or on police, or in shelling out money to support the market system, like bank bailouts or quantitative spending, like quantitative easing. All of these are massive spending projects, and none of them are incompatible with neoliberalism. Then there's things like we've famously had over the COVID period, with the government shelling out huge sums of public money to private companies. And that's consistent with a lot of health spending, with things like private-public partnerships, in which hospitals and stuff are built by the government providing huge sums of money to private companies. So rather than building the hospitals themselves, which would be less consistent with a neoliberal system. And this gets the core of this argument. The core of the problem with this argument is that even if spending has increased, which it has, public spending has increased, that doesn't mean that it wouldn't have. It doesn't mean if it wouldn't have increased more if neoliberal ideology hadn't taken over. So Colin really has to watch his counterfactuals here. But fundamentally, if there was public spending on healthcare, and all that public spending stayed within the public sphere, say, for example, hospital building was done outside of public-private partnerships, say that cleaning was kept in-house, say that the NHS got its own, like Corbyn's government. Oh God, that was hauntology there. I did a hauntology. I said Corbyn's government. Oh, I almost saw into a different universe in which things were not quite as shit. Corbyn's Labour was suggesting setting up an NHS drug company so that they could provide off-brand drugs for the NHS. That would be an example of public spending which was fundamentally not neoliberal, because it was taking responsibility for something back into the hands of the state rather than pushing it out. But you could, again, that might have ended up being cheaper than what we have now, in which the state pays huge amounts of money to drug companies for more expensive drugs. That is more neoliberal and more expensive. So this idea that public spending correlates with something being neoliberal or not is not based on any theoretical or empirical fact. It is just asserted by this, and I can't stress this enough, professor of government. And again, all this argument is based on a misunderstanding that neoliberalism is necessarily small state government, which is flat out wrong. But even there, he says, despite, he says at one point, despite widespread privatisation and outsourcing, followed by the idea that the maintenance of public sector employment rates, like the idea that because they haven't fallen, is not neoliberalism. He's providing counter evidence to his own claim at the start of a sentence, because privatisation and outsourcing of services is a far more direct way of measuring the size of the state and the services being provided to people through the means of the state than measuring the number of people employed by the public services. And one important point about this is that in the UK, at least, local public sector employment is at historic low compared with central government public sector employment, which indicates a retreat of the state at a local level and is consistent with within neoliberalism. Pinko Punko is saying, what a world you took us to for a moment. I know, man. Maybe if I just try hard enough, I can drag us all, I can lathe us through into this new separate universe in which things... they're not great, but they're not quite as shit. And it's a bit depressing that is the ambition right now, of making things not quite as shit. So here we get to a nice bold point from Professor Talbot here. This is a point he's very proud of. He wants us to emphasise this point, this crux of his argument, this something that he thinks that'll have all the people who think that neoliberalism is real will be on their knees when they hear this point. He says, so where is neoliberalism in all this? The answer is, whilst it exists in talk, it is rarely translated into decisions and actions that would come even remotely close to a vision of a neoliberal state that its critics claim is being created. We are no nearer the neoliberal state now than we were in the 1980s, nor have most political parties, especially social democratic ones, been taken over by neoliberalism. So where is neoliberalism in all this? Well, let's see. Since the 1980s, as a result of anti-union legislation supported by all parties in the UK and in the US, union density is at a historic low. Welfare has been totally reformed into workfareism, which forces the individual into particular behaviours with things like mandating constantly seeking work or signing contracts emphasising personal responsibility. Financial markets have been deregulated, resulting in the 2008 financial crash, after which they remained deregulated, despite yet supported and saved by the state, as a good neoliberal state should do. The NHS in the UK has been increasingly privatised and outsourced. The higher education system has been reformed along market lines that's now a commodity to be bought, in which students are the consumer and the university the seller of a commodity. Trains have been privatised, the Royal Mail is privatised, energy has been privatised, and many have been trying to get water privatised. State provision of housing has been dramatically sliced down in favour of ever-increasing private rentals, which again are often supported through tax breaks by the neoliberal state. Increasingly undemocratic free trade deals have been signed, local government spending has been constrained, and we just had a period of 10 years of austerity during which the entire thrust of government action was nominally to reduce public spending. A period in which Talbot was writing this terrible, uninformed, poorly written, dog shit piss article. So that's where the neoliberalism is. Because fundamentally, if we take on his assumptions, which, I repeat, are wrong, and you look at the vast number of academics, including people like Bob Jessup or Neil Davidson or Bruffin Starnes, Paul O'Connell, or me, to show that. But if we take his assumptions, increased social spending and steady size of public sector employment doesn't prove neoliberal ideology doesn't exist within the state. At best, it provides some evidence that neoliberal ideology might be ineffective in achieving its goals, but even then, he accepts that there's been widespread privatisation and outsourcing, so his point is extremely weak. I mean, it's a piss article. It's a bad piss article. I stand by that. Thank Pinko Punko just saying cackled at my summary of the article. And there's not much more to say about it. It's a stream of just shite. He goes on to say, as if to prove my point, neoliberalism exists as a boogeyman, created on the left to oppose various conservative attempts to, quote, rebalance government-market relations. These attempts on the right were far less dramatic than both their proponents and opponents suggested. To say neoliberalism exists as a boogeyman to impose the rebalancing of the government-market relation is one of the most ideologically charged statements in this piece of shit article. He says, there have been changes, to be sure, both at country level and in specific policy areas. A couple of countries did significantly reduce the size of public spending. Both New Zealand and Ireland, for different reasons, went from over half of GDP to around a third over 2 decades. But other larger countries like Germany, France, the UK and the USA remained more or less stable or grew slightly. Spending on some types of social programs reduced, especially housing, but in others, health and education, it often grew. Trauma is saying, did you see Talbot's screed claiming the 200k Corbynista Labour members were the combined membership of the Communist Party going back to the 1950s? I did not. I'm going to be honest, I had never heard of Colin Talbot before I saw this article being retweeted by one Ewan Phillips. Glowingly retweeted by one Ewan Phillips. So I've been gloriously unaware of his presence. But if he's got the keen, incisive mind to say that the largely young Corbynista Labour members were the combined membership of Communist Party going back to the 1950s, well, I don't know how I can stand in the face of such an intellectual titan as this. What he's saying here about so going back to what he's saying here about the social spending in the UK and the USA. So if we look at health and education in the US and UK, we all know that US government spending on health is massive. And it's actually bigger than, as a proportion of GDP, than UK spending of health. But we also all know that the US doesn't have government-provided healthcare, which I think might point to one of the reasons why government spending isn't a particularly useful indicator of the provision of government services, and therefore of neoliberalism, even in the poor way that Talbot has described it here. And as with health spending, this increased spending could reflect the ageing population and increased need of health services, and the outsourcing of services, which is often more expensive and less efficient. Paradoxically meaning that the higher health spending in this case might in fact be an indicator that neoliberal policies are actually taken over. Because one good example, and the example that's always used, is with the privatisation of health services, is the case of cleaners in the UK. In the UK health service, once the cleaning services were outsourced to private companies, costs increased and standards went down. So, but that would indicate public spending would go up because costs increased and standards went down. So this undermines his entire point about public spending being related to neoliberalism, because again it just implies that even within his poor framework of neoliberalism, in which public spending is the be-all and end-all, and that they're trying to get small state is what you're after, outsourcing services is a costly process. And all of this is basically to say spending is not a good way of indicating ideological processes within a state, which a professor of government should know. And he goes on to say, neoliberalism has become a term of abuse. I'll read to the end of this article and then I'll talk a bit about my finishing thoughts on it. He says neoliberalism has become a term of abuse and an obstacle to serious thinking about what is and is not happening in politics and public policy. Perhaps This is best illustrated by some counterexamples using the idea of quote, socialism. Does any reform that replaces the free market solution amount to socialism? Of course not. When the UK's telephone system was nationalised by the Asquith Liberal government in 1912, was this socialism? When the Macmillan Conservative government in the 1950s committed to and achieved building 3,000 council houses, was this socialism? Most reasonable observers would say no, of course it isn't socialism, but when the equivalent reforms in the opposite direction occur, they are immediately branded as neoliberal. Neoliberalism is a convenient myth invented by opponents of any type of pro-market reform or political position that recognises markets may, in the right circumstances, be a good thing. Everyone from moderate social democrats to the most lurid free marketeers get lumped together under a convenient neoliberal label. I suppose it saves the bother of actually thinking, but otherwise it's not helpful. Now, if I had just written this article, in which I, 1, misunderstand what neoliberalism is, and 2, even within that misunderstanding of what neoliberalism is, don't sufficiently provide any evidence to back up what my point that it doesn't exist is, by pointing to public spending, which doesn't make sense, I would maybe not invoke that other people are not thinking. I would maybe have some, maybe some thought that what I am doing is bullshit. I am bullshitting, and invoking other people not thinking might not be helpful for you. Punko, he's mocking the same logic he used earlier to show his logic works. What? I know, it doesn't make any sense. The entire thread of his article has been using this logic which he is specifically mocking here. And it's because, fundamentally it's because he doesn't really care if neoliberalism is a myth or is a reality. What his point is that he doesn't like being called a neoliberal, but he wants to defend the current order. So he wants to make sure that the current order can't be labelled anything which he perceives as negative. He wants to defend it, and he perceives neoliberalism as being negative. Hence the reason why the first thing he brought up was people saying, this is a term of abuse, and nobody self-identifies as it. Because he doesn't want neoliberalism. He doesn't care about neoliberalism, the concept. He likes how things are right now and wants to maintain them. But what I would say, he says this is that neoliberalism is a block to understanding politics. What's really the obstacle to understanding what's going on in society, I'd say, is providing an obfuscation to the well-established ideological drivers at play within society. It's using your position to deny the political realities around us and make it harder to understand what world we live in. Fundamentally, if Big Colin here doesn't think we live in a neoliberal society, what would he call it? Would he call it social democratic? Is Britain in 2020 or 2016, whenever he was writing this piece of shit, similar to Sweden in the 1970s or Denmark now? Of course it's not. That would be an absurd argument. And it's why he doesn't get into it, because he's not interested in actually understanding the political realities of the UK. He's interested in providing cover for an ideology which has caused a massive increase in inequality, decline in public services, increase in rents, and now a massive spike in poverty and food insecurity. And if Colin doesn't understand about what he's talking about, he should just not speak. And what really gets me is, again, and I keep bringing this up, this guy is a professor of government, and he can just spout off this uninformed shite without doing any research on the topic, and is so overtly ideological, yet we still have to live in a world in which academia is a supposed Marxist plot. It's wild. Nightmare masterclass. What do you make of critiques of the neoliberal framework from the left which posit that it's really just a poor semantic analogue for capitalism in general? I heard this a few times when I was active in DSA. So the arguments that these are tendencies within capitalism have merit. Sorry, just taking a wee drink of water. I've been ranting for a while and my wine's ran out, so my voice is getting raspy. I'm getting a raspy voice now. Oh God, I started sounding Glasgow then. Woo! I'll get back to answering your question in just 1 second. I need to take a big drink of water. So, yeah. The argument that neoliberalism just represents tendencies within capitalism. There is some merit to that, and particularly in regards to people like Poulantzas, who argues that capitalism will start to develop more authoritarian tendencies, and a lot of people who are critical of neoliberalism have taken on a lot of stuff from Poulantzas. But the difference is, what I would say is that these may be underlying tendencies within capitalism, but that's a thematic level discussion. We're talking about, when we're critiquing neoliberalism, we're talking about the specific ideological formations of what is happening right now within capitalism. And it's not particularly helpful to say it's just a tendency within capitalism for businesses to seek to lower profits, to lower wages, and to increase profits. That's not a particularly helpful way of understanding how society and how the state is being changed within a neoliberal framework. Like, I don't know how you would seek to explain the specific changes in welfare policy or the specific reorganization of the state under neoliberal capitalism using only a general capitalist frame. These are specific processes which are undergoing within a specific context within what we might call late capitalism. So I'm sympathetic to the argument these are just this is just capitalism in general, but I don't think it necessarily holds up to critical scrutiny when you're talking about a specific period of state and social change, because that's what we're talking about, the neoliberal period, and it is a specific ideology. Nightmare Masterclass agreed. I think the term has certain explanatory power. It does, and that's one of the things that I talked about this. I can't remember if I talked about this in the stream that lost or the stream that, no, it was at the start of the stream. When we talk about neoliberalism, and one of the reasons why we can understand it as an ideology, as something that definitely does exist, is because we can see these repeated patterns of policy and underlying rationale of that policy popping up again and again and again in different states and over different times. One of the more common ones is personal responsibility being invoked, which is often used to justify certain things within welfare, but also personal responsibility was used as an analogue to justify austerity in the UK, and in terms of like conceiving of the economy as a personal pocketbook. And you might be able to point to certain processes which tend towards these ideas, but these are the specific ideas which exist now and find basis within a defined ideological moment and a defined ideological movement, drawing from the Montpellier Society, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, all these people. I mean, it's certainly changed over that time, as all ideologies do, but you can find core aspects of that ideology within these people. So that was my whirlwind tour of a no good, terrible article by a idiot academic. I'm sorry for anyone who missed bits and pieces because the stream broke down right at the start, because for some reason, again, the internet here runs like I was in 1997, and that anytime the phone goes off, the internet goes off and I lose stream. Seems to happen every time. It's really annoying. Thanks, Pinko Punko. I'll hang out for a few more minutes if anyone wants to chat or anything. I'll talk a bit about what my next video is going to be about, and anything else if anyone wants to chip in and ask questions or anything. So the next video is related to what I was talking about today. particularly in relation to welfare, because I've been really busy the past few weeks, past month or so, because I've got a deadline, a PhD writing deadline for before Christmas to get my methodology chapter and introduction chapter done for a PhD. I've just managed to finish writing my introduction, which I'm pretty glad about. Just have to edit it, but I've not had enough time in reaching this deadline and doing a huge amount of research that a lot of my videos take. If anyone's ever hello Kevin Logan, a wee if anyone's ever looked at the bibliographies of my videos, they'll know that they take a hell of a lot of research. I've not had time to do that level of research, so instead this next video is going to be a bit more of a personal reflective essay, and a bit more of a discussion about my experience working within the UK, the welfare system in the UK. Because I used to work for a welfare rights charity in Glasgow, which was a pretty difficult experience. People were often scared and often worried about their lives, so they were often abusive, and often people were in extreme poverty, and you had to sort of navigate your way through that. And it was just an endless cycle of people getting denied their rights and denied their welfare, and going through these endless processes of appealing to get a tiny amount of money. If anyone has seen the movie, the Ken Loach movie, I, Daniel Blake, I was one of the people who would have helped. Who I worked for a charity that would have helped people like Daniel Blake. And it's a movie I cannot watch to this day because it reminds me too much of work, of that job, and of it wasn't unusual to be helping someone with an appeal process, and then because the process took months, it wasn't unusual to have someone working an appeal process and then have them die before they'd even finish that process, as happens in I, Daniel Blake. So it was a bit of a difficult job. So I'll be talking a bit about that in the next video, alongside some discussions about wider neoliberalised welfare and bullshit jobs, bringing in the late great David Graeber, and some of his perspective on bullshit jobs, because fundamentally the bullshit job, my job, that job was a bullshit job. It didn't need to exist. If we had a welfare system which helped people without them having to go through these massive hoops, if the fundamental drive behind our welfare system was to help, then my job wouldn't have existed. My job only existed to support a terrible system. And it was weird. I remember reading bullshit jobs, and and at the end there was a paragraph written by someone who worked for a welfare rights charity, and it was eerie because that person could have been me. Like the in a very the way that they wrote and described their life working within the welfare rights system was just almost exactly word for word how I'd described my experience. So yeah, that's gonna be the topic of the next video, which should be out next week, if anyone's interested. So thanks for stopping along. Anyone who was in both streams, I'll keep both up because I talked a little bit about stuff in the first stream. But thanks for popping along. I was going to talk a bit about, when I was planning the stream, I was going to talk a bit about the School of Life video which I saw. I think it was so bad that they've taken down off of their YouTube because I could only find mirrors of it. It was a School of Life video from Alan the Bottom, in which he basically argues that the reason that some states are rich and some states are poor is because some are religious and some aren't, and the richer you are, the less religious you are. He argues that without any context, that Pinko Punko, sounds good, harrowing. Thanks for the education. Thanks for coming. I appreciate you all coming along. Yes, and Big Alan Bottom says Big Alan Bottom, he says that it says this without context, that a state having lots of resources means that they will be poor. He points to African states which are resource rich with oil or with coltan, and they're poor. And the whole video is basically a whole video on the relationship between correlation and causation, but he doesn't quite get the fundamentals of that relationship right. He seems the whole video is basically correlation and causation. Those two things are the same, aren't they? As he goes through, like, resource-rich countries are always poor. Oh, well, why might that be, Alan? Why might resource-rich countries be poor? Is it maybe because of the history of being colonised and exploited by the global north? Do you think that might have anything to do with it, Alan? Is that what's going on? And he talks about them having people in the global north having a more entrepreneurial attitudes and having better attitudes to work and going out and getting work. The whole thing is just a terrible video. Frankly, I don't think... I was going to show it on stream, but I frankly just don't think my coal-powered laptop could handle it. A little secret about me, everything I own is shit. My internet goes off when someone phones the house. My laptop cannot stream videos or do anything else. It has a hard time coping with having an article scrolling. So it probably wouldn't have worked anyway. But as we've come to the end of the article, Pinko Punko, what are you saying? The talk about School of Life lately dredged up a memory that when I was first getting into Marxism and watched the School of Life video on it, I don't want to go back and see what it was. I think I know exactly which Marxism video it was, because I remember seeing that exact video. I can't remember the details, but the video was maybe one of the worst videos I've ever seen trying to explain Marxism. And the girl I was dating at the time really liked School of Life, so I couldn't be so overt in how much I hated it, but I can now, which is, I guess that's something. But I really hate Alan Bottom. I hate his bullshit. I hate his nonsense about bullshit, fucking the personal relationship nonsense about how, people who have, for some reason he thinks that children who have secure relationships when they're younger have bad relationships when they're older because they expect to have good relationships, which is just factually the opposite of what's true. like according to anyone who knows anything about that. Like, if you have bad relationships as a child, you're more likely to have, not great relationships as you grow up. Not for any sort of moralistic reason, but because Punko saying anything with a British accent apparently gives you credibility nowadays. Yeah, I wish that worked with the Scottish. Scottish accents don't seem to have that same. Actually, I don't know if that's true, because I do remember reading that Edinburgh accents are the most trusted pilot accents. But they have a bit less gravitas. If I had the voice of Ollie Thorne in Philosophy Tube, I think I'd maybe have a bit more gravitas. And maybe I could start a bullshit School of Life series if I had Alan Bottom's voice. There was one video Alan Bottom did, where he was talking about. I saw it. I know where I saw it. This was in Big Joel's video on it. They were talking about he was talking about a video they had with a capitalist stand, a capitalist muffin stand, cake stand, and a socialist one. And the capitalist one had all these beautiful cakes that had big icing and decorations on it. And they sold those cakes, whereas the socialist one was just plain cakes. And for some reason, that people wanted the decorated cakes meant that capitalism was better. And it's just like, it goes back to this thing with this article. If you don't know about something, you don't have to talk about it. No one's forcing you to say these things, Alan. No one's forcing you into this. Just don't embarrass yourself, you big baldy. Political baldy as well as physical. And then there was the video about where Alan Bottom says that Alan the Bottom says to attract someone on a date, you should order something which is unusual to catch their attention, to show them that you don't play by the rules. And his example for this is to go to a restaurant with the girl that you're dating and order fish fingers from the kids menu. and I just thought, like, when I get back into dating, after everything, I'm gonna take a girl I really like. I'm gonna start dating her, take her to a restaurant, an expensive restaurant, and I'm gonna take her. I'm gonna be dressed up in a suit, a really fancy suit. I'll cut my hair, I'll shave. I'll look fucking hot as hell. I'll sit down, I'll be polite. When the waiter comes to offer me wine, I'll order wine. Of course I'll order wine. I'm a sophisticated man about town. I'll order a lovely red. And with that red, I'll ask for the child's menu, at which point I'll order the fish fingers. And when they arrive, I'll pick up one fish finger, dip it in the kids' pot of tomato sauce that they've also given me, and the wee bib that they've also given me. I'll dip it in the tomato sauce and I'll take a single bite, and I'll look my date directly in the eye as she is understandably flustered by the situation. And I'll say to her, does this fish finger, does this intrigue you? And then I will know. I might as well put a ring on that finger, because that is how, according to Alan Bottom, that is how you win a girl's heart. That is dating, according to the relationship expert of Alan the Bottom. Beautiful stuff. And on that note of my post-COVID, Paul Singleton, she wouldn't expect you to order a Ribena fruit shoot missing a power moosh. Oh, I would like a wee. Maybe that's a good move. A wee Ribena. And I could. Oh man. Oh god. Oh, Pinko Punko. No, well, somebody hasn't seen School of Life. Imagine how much of a red flag that would be on a first date if somebody said they were a big fan of the School of Life. Oh, I think I would take someone ordering fish fingers off the kids menu in a restaurant before I'd take them admitting that they were a School of Life fan. Right. On that note, probably we'll call that a day for a stream. We've had a bit of chilled out time post my my not mad online rant about terrible academics and their terrible academia, and we had a nice chat about fish fingers and Alan the Bottom. So we'll call that a day for the stream. We all happy? I'll shove on some cool down music from my there we go, some cool down funk just to sign us off for the day. And tomorrow's Friday. New Philosophy Tube video tomorrow, which is exciting. Always a good moment. And then a week until Christmas. Catch you next time, Pinko Punko. Thanks for coming along and thanks for being active in the chat.